Hello, you. We are back and we are talking about Joe Goldberg again. A disclaimer, we will be talking about Book Joe today of Carolyn Kepner's fate. I kind of do plan to make cohesive thoughts about the series whenever we watched it again, but that will be in the distant future probably because I'm just terrible at watching series. When the last season was due to come out, I obviously wanted to reread all the books again. I just really love this series and feel like I wasn't done talking about it because I talked about it in relation to the TV show last time. So I feel like I wanted to talk about the books in their own right, but I didn't really have a direction I wanted to go in, and I thought it would be interesting to talk about the things we learn about Joe throughout the series because they're actually quite few and far between. Because as we all know, Joe's a really unreliable narrator. I thought it'd be interesting to kind of piece together what we know about him and kind of try to analyze his character from there. I also started to write down the reasons why I like Joe so much because Joe is a really important character to me, okay? And I know that might be really weird to say, but I feel like I'm gonna make you understand it as I go along here. I feel like there's a certain relatability about Joe outside of the fact that he's a murderer that makes his character so compelling. And this goes for the TV show as well. So I wanted to kind of get in and analyze that about myself. And, considering there are so many people who feel this way about Joe, maybe that would be personally relatable to somebody watching this video right now. So in the end, I had this amalgamation of notes about random shit about these books, and it's kind of turned into a pseudo intellectual rant about Joe Goldberg, the women who love him, and what that says about us as a society. So if that sounds interesting to you, I hope that you will hear me out. Also, if you just want to know some details about Book Joe, if you maybe don't want to read the books for yourself, then I will be talking about that a lot throughout. So maybe stick around for that. I'm personally just doing this because I really love the series and I just want to talk about it. Literally nobody else in my life reads books, dude. So I'm just out here screaming into the void and hoping that somebody wants to have a productive conversation. I really think there aren't enough people out here analyzing the character of Joe Goldberg because I really think he is going to be one of the greats. I think he's going to become a classic. I don't know. So as for me personally, I think I was always primed to love a character like Joe. Growing up, I always liked the underdog characters and the villain characters. And it's interesting because Joe obviously sees himself as an underdog, very clearly is the villain. I was weirdly obsessed with Alex DeLarge of A Clockwork Orange when I was in college. And there are numerous reasons why, and maybe I'll make a video about that one day. The main thing to note is Alex, despite being violent and what some people would consider a monster, had a lot of humanizing qualities. He's a questionable protagonist, okay? And the language of the book by Anthony Burgess, he completely made it up. Well, it's not completely, it's like a mix of English and this made up language that he created just for this book. And the book is told through Alex's perspective, so it shows that Alex is this intelligent person. He has this grasp of the English language, and it's something that I really like about the character because he's able to manipulate you somewhat to be on his side because he can talk good. Basically same could be said about Joe. I went on obviously to love another controversial one, Lolita by Nabokov. Same again in that Humbert uses language to kind of seduce the reader, to kind of make what he did seem less bad. And for some people it works. The book has been described as a romance despite clearly being about a nonce. So that brings us around to Joe. Considering all of this, my mum was always trying to get me to watch the series, and I did, and I do love the series and I do love Joe in the series, but he is just kind of not Joe in the book for a lot of it, which is understandable because they went in a lot of different directions than the book did. I feel like the spirit of the book was always kind of there though, but that's, I don't know, I'm not meant to be talking about the show right now. Basically, I did really like the show, and then I read the second book in the series first because that's the only one we had a physical copy of because my mum bought it by accident. And the Book Joe has just always been the best one for me. I love Book Joe, and I love Carolyn Kepner as a writer. I feel like she's really talented. I always say that to go and read her book for an hour is to go and sit down with Joe and listen to him speak for an hour. I really feel like I'm wrapped up in his world. I don't know if anybody else feels this way, but I just do. So I obviously can't psychologically evaluate Joe Goldberg, okay? I don't have the credentials for that, but I can talk about Joe as a character from a literary analysis perspective, do have a little bit of experience with that. And also, I can talk about why I personally love him, and seeing as so many people relate to him in the same way from what I've seen online, okay? I feel like I can somewhat, say that says something about us as humans, right? So this is actually a philosophical video, and I'm actually going to start now. So we're going to start with a little list of things that we know concretely about Joe Goldberg from empirical evidence in the text, okay? There isn't a lot, I'm not going to lie, because the one thing that we do know about Joe is that he's an unreliable narrator. We know a lot more about the way that Joe sees himself and the narrative he's created for himself in his life. He is a hopeless romantic. Once he falls in love with a woman, he will do anything to get her, and he will do anything to keep her and keep her safe. Safe, because his definition of safe is a lot different to mine. Joe also, I can't help but note, sees himself as a massive raging feminist, which is obviously funny for the reason that he murders women, but also just because there's misogyny peppered throughout the text, okay? It's just in the very language that he uses, and it's also in things that he can't hide about his character, like the way that he treats women that he's not attracted to. There's a woman, Delilah, in the second book, who he immediately dismisses as some slut, basically. Joe treats her with a lot of disdain, and then when he's in a dark place, like he's broken up with his girlfriend or whatever, he uses her for sex. And then he does in fact kill her. Because he basically doesn't want his girlfriend to know that he did a Ross. This woman is disposable to him. She's of no value to him. So he doesn't respect women. He only respects women that he's attracted to, which of course isn't very feminist of him, is it? One thing that Joe will do to manipulate the narrative is he will leave out details that make him look less favourable. An example I can think of is at the end of the first book. Beck, his girlfriend, discovers a box in his wall that has got some of her things in, keepsakes from their relationship, right? That's a normal thing. We know about the box in the narrative, and although we know that he has stolen some things, the things he has admitted to are not as like gross and disturbing as some of the things that are in the box that Joe has conveniently left out of the narrative. And it's not even necessarily that he's lying to us. I feel like we are in Joe's head in the books. So it's Joe is lying to himself, because I think he knows that some of the stuff in this box is not normal. Like there's a used tampon in there. There's her high school yearbook or whatever. He just there's no reason why he should have that, and it's creepy that he has that. You know, Joe doesn't want to admit to himself these darker parts of his personality. He wants to believe that he's this normal, cool, chill guy. He conveniently leaves these things out, and he also employs evasive language. Think about Humbert from Nabokov's Lolita, okay? He uses flowery language, and I feel like he uses a lot of words to say something really simple, so that it's kind of almost hard to follow, and it makes what he did not just confusing, but it like lessens the impact of what he did and makes it sound a lot more romantic and flowery and poetic. Joe does the same thing, but he's very blunt in a lot of the rest of the narrative, but he loves a good metaphor, I feel, and it's in these metaphors where he hides some of his less admirable traits, okay? Especially when he's talking about doing a dastardly deed, okay? When he's talking about being a bad guy, that's when he'll go into the more flowery metaphorical language. And so it's easy for him to gloss over details, especially if he's quick with the way he describes these things, and then he quickly moves on to what he was doing after this. It's very easy, I think, especially if you're reading this casually, to miss some details of what he did because Joe is so quick to gloss over them himself. And sometimes when you reread, you realize that Joe did something really nasty that you didn't even realize he did, because it was so cloaked in metaphor and, you know, just hidden in there like a little gem. It's easy for Joe to leave out details like this because a book is not a visual medium. And so if Joe doesn't tell us something, we have no idea that it's happened unless one of the other characters brings it up. And even then, Joe sometimes glosses over what other characters are saying and kind of summarizes. So sometimes we may never know some of the things that Joe did. It's another disadvantage, I think, of the TV show, because it being a visual medium, we do see a lot of what is happening around Joe. And so it's harder to make Joe look like a good guy in the way that he does internally in the book. So they have to do it in other ways. I know I said I wouldn't talk about the show, but it's kind of hard, okay? Something that I really wanted to focus on when looking at Joe's character was the narration inside his head versus his speech, because this is a thing in the show as well. Joe talks to get out of things. He manipulates the situation with his language in order to get what he wants. And he does this in the book too. I find it so much more interesting in the book because we can see a lot more of what's happening inside his head, and we can really see the disparity between what he's thinking and what he's saying. So when it comes to things like his backstory, I feel like a lot of the things that he said aloud to people I would take with a pinch of salt, because a lot of the things he said out loud were lies. So why would I trust him to say anything about his past? Especially when, we'll get to it later, Joe is kind of dismissive of his past. He doesn't want anybody to really know about that. I definitely took the things that he thought of in his internal narration more seriously in regards to his past and his backstory than the things that he said aloud. But I did take them somewhat into consideration, especially when they were more in line with the things that I did know from his internal narration. I think it would be very easy to just take everything that Joe says about his backstory at face value, but it's just something to think about. For example, in the second book, Joe has a romance with this girl, Love, and she ends up getting pregnant. But by the third book, because she's found out about his past and stuff, the way that Joe tells it, she's separated him from his son and given him basically a restraining order. So he's not allowed to see his son. And she's basically tormenting him by putting up Instagram stories and not blocking Joe on them, even though she said she was going to block him on everything, because she wants him basically to see his son grow up in pictures instead of in real life to torture him. Love turns up at the end of the third book and she's got a gun. And she's kicking off because she did all this because she knows how Joe is from knowing his past so well. And she thought that if Joe really loved her, he would pursue her, which I guess is kind of true. And it's interesting because in the second book, it wasn't narrated in second person because Love was never you to Joe. She was never special to him like that. It is interesting that he didn't pursue Love despite everything, because she wasn't the one in the same way that some of these other girls were. Anyway, Love's side of the story was when she got pregnant, that was when Joe stopped being interested in her at all, because he just saw her as like an incubator for his baby. And he was only interested in having a progeny. Joe obviously adamantly denies that this is true, and he says that he would have given anything for them to be a proper family and blah, blah, blah. Just everything that you would expect the perfect man to say in this situation. And even in his head, he's like, I might be lying about this a little bit, but it's because she's got a gun to my head. So I think it is interesting to note, though, that after Love dies in this scenario, Joe does not pursue his son whatsoever, despite saying he cares about his son so much all the time and saying that he'd give anything to be reunited with him. Basically, after this incident, he never mentions the kid again. You can't really trust Joe on what he says he cares about. And I know that that's stupid to say, considering he says he cares about women and then kills them. But people are so weirdly, they're so weirdly willing to gloss over that detail sometimes that I'm pointing out other places where Joe is not the best human being, okay? Another instance of this is in the third book. You, for Joe, is this girl called MK who works at the library, and they have this whole affair. She's got a husband and stuff. She ends up in a coma. She has an accident and she ends up in a coma. And even though Joe has been talking about how everything about them is perfect and he's finally found the one, and obviously you think that if he felt that way about someone, that he would be at her bedside every day looking after her until, you know, she woke up or she like died for real. Joe eventually just abandons her, and he doesn't check up on her. And the daughter that he was so insistent upon adopting of hers, that he claimed to care so much about, he doesn't even check up on her at all. But in the fourth book, we actually find out that her only family, her aunt who lived there with them, has been found dead. Obviously, Joe murdered her in the last book, but the kid doesn't know that. And Joe doesn't even check in on her until he thinks that people are suspicious of him and he wants to find information. Joe literally doesn't care about anyone, basically, is what I'm trying to say. That's what I've gleaned from all of this. Let's get more into Joe's personality instead of vague things about his character as far as the narrative goes. Joe loves books. He loves words. Books are to Joe what music is to Alex, more in the film than in the book of A Clockwork Orange. It's this humanizing thing for him. It's something that he loves and is passionate about, that is easy and relatable to a lot of people. And because they are so passionate about it and they're so knowledgeable about it, because it's such an extreme of that relatability, I feel like there's this absolving nature to it somewhere deep inside of us. I don't know. Maybe it's just me. There is a little paragraph at the start of one of the chapters. I think it might be in the third book. I don't know. Joe talks about how when you're a kid, your parents read to you, but he didn't have anybody to read to him. So he had to read to himself. And somewhere along the way, he could he literally describes it as a split, which I know all the BPD girls are going to be like, OMG, so me. But I know that we want to do that, okay, but we're not doing that today. We're doing literary analysis. So this split, Joe becomes both the reader and the listener. And I think that's really interesting because it's not only obviously indicative of some personality deficits that exists in Joe as a character, but also Joe, this is what I've been talking about, is him being an unreliable narrator. Joe in his head is the writer of his own story. Whatever he is telling himself is true. And I think that is so dangerous. He completely lives in a fantasy land and it completely hinges on his emotions and what is going on with his significant other. It's a really dangerous way to live. It's somebody who's just not in check of their emotions at all and of reality at all. Joe thinks this is good though, because it means that he's like self reliant and he doesn't need anybody else to get by. And he sees that as a good thing. He's like, basically a lone wolf. He literally says he doesn't value friendship. He doesn't try to keep in touch with any of the actual people in his life who might like him. Like there's one guy at the bookstore, I can't remember his name right now, it might be Ethan. But he's pretty chill and cool, and he gets married to Blythe from Beck's college, and they keep inviting him to stuff, and because he's pursuing some new girl in a new city, he doesn't care about them anymore. But then Joe will keep up with like random people that he encounters on his adventures. There's Chet and Rose, whose wedding was going on when he was burying Beck in the woods somewhere after he killed her. He checks in on them on Facebook. He and this girl called Amy pretend to be somebody else and get dinner with these people on holiday in Little Compton. And Joe finds those people on social media and kind of keeps up with what they're doing. And it's like he sees these people as his friends more than real people who want to connect with him in his life, because Joe just prefers fantasy over reality. We see that obviously in the women that he spins narratives for and puts into roles in his life. But it's just so weird that he actively pushes away actual real human connection. I feel like it's this need to feel self-sufficient is just not working out for him, bro. So interesting to note as like a dichotomy to him loving books. He hates technology and he hates on social media all the time, but he couldn't do literally any of the heavy lifting of what he does, stalking people, without social media. It's a huge tool to him, and I feel like he would be lost without it. He's a massive hypocrite, but he doesn't even realize it. And I feel like there are points in the narrative where he praises technology and he loves technology because it's given him the breakthrough he needs to go and stalk some girl, and then he'll immediately go back to hating it and wishing that it had never existed and saying it's ruined society. Joe just lives in the moment, okay, and he only sees in black and white. So when technology is doing the work for him, it's a great thing, but when technology is letting other guys text his girlfriend, he hates it. Joe has also got this insane sense of working class pride. He sees himself as better than people who have been handed things in life and who have been able to afford college and things like that, because he's made something of himself basically without any starts. He's got this analogy in the first book where he calls himself Coca-Cola because it's the universal American beverage and everybody loves it. It starts out because Beck in the first book has a love interest called Benji, who invented his own home soda brand. And Joe sees it as really pretentious for him to kind of have this, like, I think it's like a vegan, what is it meant to be? Cream soda? Is that what it's meant to be? I do not like cream soda. I have no idea. But he thinks that Benji is bougie, essentially. And so he's like, oh, he's home soda and I'm Coke. And I feel like this theme somewhat continues throughout the series, but I don't know what to say about it. Like, he dates Love and she's in the upper crusts of society. She literally takes a bath in champagne, and so he often uses champagne as a metaphor for love and the performative nature of their relationship. And then he's with this girl called Wonder in the last book, and she really loves culottes, but I have no idea what a culotte is, and I looked it up and now I can't remember what it is again. I feel like I thought it was some kind of coffee drink, but I feel like it's a milkshake. Which, what does that say? That she's too young for him? I don't know. I don't know about the drinks analogy. This is just something that I noticed, and if anybody wants to try and comment on what that means at all, based on the very little context that I've given you here, I would love that. I would absolutely love to have that conversation. Now we will move on to a section I will call Why is Joe the Way He Is? And it mostly discusses what we know about his backstory. So people, especially women, are always running away from Joe. That's been a theme from a very young age. Obviously, his mum left him and his dad one day and never came back. He worked in the bookshop with Mr. Mooney, and he left a very expensive book on the counter and some woman swiped it. He spent a lot of time, I think maybe he says months or years, searching for this woman, just going out on the streets looking at people and trying to find her, but he never did. And there was also an incident he mentioned where an uncle came to see him when he was younger and said he was going to take him away to live with him, but then the uncle died before he could come and pick him up. And so Joe just stayed where he was. But he didn't find out about that until after. So for him, it just felt like the guy forgot about him. So we can see that we've got this theme of abandonment and this theme of, if Joe doesn't have somebody in sight, there's possibility that they're just never going to come back again, right? There's also this story that he tells about his school bag. I forgot about the school bag story. He says that when he was in school, he had to see a counselor because he wouldn't leave his school bags in the locker room or whatever. He would want to bring his bags into the classroom with him because he was scared that basically he would come back to the locker room at the end of the day and his bags would be gone. If he didn't have his eyes on the bags, then they would disappear, like these people in his life. And like, bags are women are bags, essentially. Joe is afraid to take his eyes off the women that he loves because otherwise they might just never come back. Which is sad. This is a sad bit, guys. You're allowed to feel bad for Joe a little bit here because he was just a little baby when these things were happening to him. And it's also kind of not his fault that he's psychologically damaged in this way, okay? So now, oh my god, dude, what is going on in this video? So Joe talks about, this is going to sound like it comes out of nowhere, okay? Joe talks about 9/11 a lot because 9/11 was a pivotal point in his life. It was, I know it sounds stupid to say because anybody who was alive at that time, anybody who remembers it, has like a memory attached to it. But that comes into play in my analysis of this, I promise you. But Joe's 9/11 story is especially strange because he wasn't aware that it happened because Mr. Moody had locked him in the cage for a few days. And so while everybody else out in America was like looking for people and worrying about people, his dad was at home, unconcerned that his child hadn't come back in the 9/11 attacks. Like, that is insane. So after being locked in this cage and coming out and realizing that his dad didn't care if he came home or not and if he was alive or dead, Joe was kind of set free in a way. I don't want to say he was set free by 9/11, that's insane. He was set free by the cage. Make a mental note of that. It was this rebirth for Joe. He had his own life after that. He knew he didn't have to come home all the time, and eventually he probably just stopped coming home at all. I don't think he ever kept up with his dad at all. He also probably felt connected to the public for the first time in ages because, like I said, everybody was looking for somebody after 9/11. You all remember the pictures of like the missing posters and stuff like that. So what Joe does is he like either ask people what they were doing on 9/11 and like their 9/11 story, or he'll like contemplate on what they were doing on 9/11. Like he says, I bet Love and her friend Milo were having sex on 9/11. It's crazy. It's funny because Joe asked them this because he feels connected to them for everybody having a significant 9/11 story, but he sees that as like a personal significance, as a sign that they're connected, right? But it's like I said earlier, of course everybody remembers that day. Everybody, a lot of people, especially in New York where Joe lives, are going to be fucking affected by that. Joe, you big silly. It's obviously like, it's the narcissism. It's the narcissism. He thinks the world revolves around him, so he's like, oh, this is a sign, and he doesn't take into account the context that we've just laid out here together. So the cage for Joe is a symbol of rebirth, but I think on a more narrative level, the cage is what Joe wants a relationship to be. Any kind of relationship, I think, but like obviously for Joe there is only the romantic relationship. So when you're in the cage, the glass cage, you can't hide from him. You can't have secrets. You're always there for him because you have no other responsibilities. Housewife, chains to the oven, barefoot, pregnant in the kitchen. Okay, that's what Joe wants on a spiritual level. Okay. When they first get the cage installed in the basement of the bookshop, the movers think that the cage is for birds, and Mr. Mooney has this little speech about how you shouldn't put birds in cages, especially glass cages, where it gives them the illusion of freedom. And that is so significant because that is what Joe is doing to these women, even before they are physically in the cage. And it's the perfect embodiment of what Joe wants a relationship to be. He's got them mentally in the cage, dude. The thing about these women is that Joe becomes the perfect man for them, and he turns up in random places where they'll be and makes it look like it's a random encounter. He does everything right, and he does it because he knows everything about them before he's ever even spoken to them for the first time. Whereas for them, it all feels like a real organic relationship. And that's the cage, right? That is the illusion of freedom that these girls have. But when he looks at a girl and he refers to her as you, and he starts doing the thing and stalking her and he's dating her, we all know, start to finish, this girl is going to end up in the cage. And so even though she's not yet physically in the cage, mentally, the girl is in the cage. And so She has from the moment Joe sets eyes on her, she has only the illusion of freedom. And Mr. Mooney tried to tell him, dude, and he didn't listen. Women are birds, not books. Okay? Joe sees women as books because books will go in the cage. Okay, they need to be preserved, they need to be protected, and they play their roles. Okay, they fit into the roles that Joe has assigned to them, and when they don't, Joe gets very, very angry. So obviously, Joe's mum is a massive question mark for all of us. Like Freud, we always want to connect a bad man to his mother. Mum, even though Joe mentions her so sparingly, because obviously it's still a painful subject for him, she's always just kind of present in the narrative. She's this hovering force over everything. Everybody wants, all his girlfriends want to know about her, obviously. When he briefly goes to the therapist, I think he mentions her. There are times randomly when he will wonder about her, wonder where she is, because he's reminded of her. When he is in a relationship with Amy, he actually mentions to her that they might go to look for her, to search for her. So I feel like that's maybe something that he does have an interest in doing one day. Maybe he's scared or whatever. It's such murky territory when it comes to his mum. If anybody else has read this and has any deeper analysis into any of this, I would love to know, because especially this next bit, it always gets me. This is why I've worn the Nevermind shirt today, because obviously Joe has his mother's Nirvana t-shirt that he's had since he was a child, and Beck dies in this shirt. So obviously we can all see, okay, this is Joe killing his mother for leaving him as a child. That's the baseline that we all understand, right? But then there are other things, like he says he's wearing a Kurt Cobain t-shirt in, I think, the third book, and so I don't know whether it was another of his mother's Nirvana t-shirts or whether he went out and bought another one to kind of represent it. So there's that. And then there's this whole thing in that book as well where he wants to visit a meadow with the girl he's seeing because it's important to her, and he keeps calling it Kurt's Meadow, the Nirvana of the meadow. And I feel like that also obviously has very much a significance to his mum, but it's like, is he saying that he wants to like die with this girl or what before everything goes wrong? I'm so confused. Or is that where he's planning to kill her? Is that already in the back of his mind and he doesn't even know it and he's telling us subconsciously? I don't know. How would you interpret that? Yeah, his mum's a monolith, but Joe refuses to let his past define him, so he doesn't think about it or analyse it at all, because we all know that's the best way to deal with past trauma, okay, is to just bottle it up and never think about it. That won't have any repercussions on your psyche whatsoever. We're obviously curious about Joe's past and his mum. We want to diagnose him as an audience, and we go through this for the entire 4 books, and then he says he's going to open up to Sarah Beth Swallows, a fellow writer, because she's got him cornered. She knows everything that he's done in his past, and so he says, fine, I'm going to tell you about my mum because she wants to write a book about him. Okay, she wants to write a fiction novel based on his crimes. And then the chapter ends. And we never discover any of the things that he said to Sarah Beth Swallows about his mum. And even though he says half of them were lies, I think that even the stuff that he made up would have been telling of the way that he feels about his mum, and so we would have been able to glean so much about him and the way that he feels about things, and so much about his past that has made him the way he is. And I love the way that Caroline Kepnes doesn't let us have it. I love the way that Joe just gets to remain the monster that he is, and we're not allowed to diagnose him. We're not allowed to let his past define him. We're not allowed to humanize him in that one final way that I feel like would be the nail in the coffin for a lot of people, to be honest. It definitely was in the show. They made Joe very forgivable in the show, and I feel like this was one of the reasons why. So now I'm going to get into some reasons why I personally love Joe Goldberg. If you relate to any of these, I would love to know. I know I'm not weirdo for liking characters like this, but it would be good to get some validation about it, okay? So sound off. Joe thinks he's smart. He is smart to a certain degree. He's well read. He's good with words. We know this. What I mean is he thinks he's smart with people, and he's actually really socially inept in a lot of ways. He gets things wrong a lot. He tries to read people and he makes up backstories for them, but they're just never on point. And even with the girls that he dates, oftentimes he does stuff that puts them off in the beginning before he learns, well, basically before he's manipulated them by killing people around them and leaving him as the only person left to comfort them. He lets his own emotions and opinions about people colour the world around him. So, like, for example, he paints Beck as this nice girl, TM, who's kind of innocent and needs saving. She's actually like this really promiscuous person, which isn't a bad thing, but it's definitely not in keeping with the nice girl image that Joe projected on her. Beck's actually a real little freak, and I don't think that Joe is particularly happy with hearing or seeing that part of her personality, and so he just kind of pushes it to the back of his mind. He thinks that she needs to get rescued from this situationship she has with Benji, but actually she's the one who's relentlessly pursuing Benji, despite him not really being that interested and just being that typical kind of guy who will allow a woman to have sex with him if she wants to, even though he knows that she sees something different in it than him. I think the thing about Beck and Benji is that Beck is deliberately putting herself into this situation where she knows she's going to get hurt. She knows the consequences of her actions. And that's a lot better than being in a relationship with Joe where she thinks it's all normal and nice and he's actually stalking her and knows everything about her and knows her whereabouts at all times. She's in the cage. When Joe is seeing MK, the married woman, in the third book, he makes out like she's this poor neglected housewife whose only concern in life is her family and being a good mother. She has this family who doesn't really care about her and she gets left alone at home all the time and it's such a shame and here's Joe to rescue her. But actually when you read the book, you discover that MK was cheating on her husband with literally any man that she could get her hands on and she wasn't that great of a person, actually. But because Joe loves her so much, right, he paints her in this really nice life. He skims over these details about her cheating with all these men because he doesn't want to believe that about the woman that he loves and he wants to, it's kind of nice in a way, he loves her so much that he wants to forgive her for the things in her past, or conversely, maybe because he knows he's done some pretty awful things in his past as well, he better have the grace to forgive people for what they have done if he wants to get on in the world karmically, I guess. Another reason I like Joe is he's what I would describe as endearingly narcissistic. Usually narcissism is obviously a negative trait, but I think that because Joe's narcissism gets in the way of what he wants so much and is a detriment to him so much, it's actually something that's almost endearing about the character. It's one of the ways that Joe receives karma throughout the books, even though he never gets jail time or anything like that. Some examples in the second book, Love's twin brother 40 hears an idea that Joe has for a skit and he goes and quickly puts it together in a back room. When he comes back, he essentially shows Joe a YouTube short that ends with a frame that says written by Joe Goldberg, and Joe is immediately smitten and sick with aspirations because secretly, even though Joe looks down on these people from the upper crust of society and thinks he's better than them because he's had to make his own way in life, he also has this secret desire to be like them because he believes that he is destined for greatness because he's a fucking narcissist. And I say narcissist not even in a diagnosy psychiatrist way, I say it in the purest, simplest form of the word, in that this is very obviously a narcissistic trait, thinking that you're better than people. Especially thinking you're better than people that you want to emulate and be like, that you essentially do actually look up to. Obviously, Love's brother just takes all of Joe's ideas for films and all of his hard work and writing that he does and claims it as his own, and Joe gets completely played and doesn't get any of the credit that he so thinks he deserves. It's fun to see Joe get played in this way, obviously. It's his own downfall for having these aspirations beyond his station mate, because he's not a good person and so he doesn't deserve these good things. And I like that the narrative sometimes lets him have his comeuppance in small ways, in personal ways that will mean something to him, right? In the fourth novel, Joe goes back to college because he wrote a book and he's convinced, right, that he is the next Salinger and it's the greatest book of all time. But basically everybody who reads it, who is a person who's knowledgeable about books and writing, fucking hates it. The woman in charge of his course and his girlfriend both can't get through it. I guess essentially it's boring. And the one woman who did say she liked it was a writer that he kidnapped and put in a cage until she read his book and then he killed her. I think it's stupid for me to say that I like Joe because he's flawed. Very obviously this is a flawed character, okay, but I'm going to use the show as a comparison again, okay, because I feel like the show made Joe almost too perfect, and I feel like the book does a good job of reminding us occasionally that Joe isn't the charming guy he's setting himself up to be. I feel like the show makes a lot of excuses for Joe because things are kind of trying to assimilate to his point of view. For instance, in the books, Joe often does bad things to good people just because he's in a bad mood or because he feels like they've personally slighted him. He fires Curtis, the original guy who worked at his bookshop, because he gave Beck Joe's home address. And Curtis obviously thought he was doing Joe a big favor here because he was giving a cute girl Joe's information. And even though it worked out well for Joe and things went well when Beck came over, he still felt the need to punish Curtis for this because it could have so easily gone wrong, and so he fires Curtis from the bookshop. The guy who he replaces Curtis with, Ethan, his name is Ethan. He's such a really nice guy and he genuinely really tries to make a relationship with Joe, and Joe's just really mean to him. He also gets 3 cats in the third book and he's really enthusiastic about these cats because the girl he's seeing likes cats. There's one evening when everything goes wrong and he feels like he's messed everything up and he decides he's going to run out of there, and he just basically packs up all his shit and then leaves the back door open as like the cats can fend for themselves. And it was really a sour moment for me because I really adored the fact that Joe had these cats and was so enthusiastic about his cats. And then, here comes Carolyn Kepnes to remind me that Joe cannot care for anyone or anything, and the second that these cats do not serve a purpose to him, he's gonna abandon them, and who cares if they live or die. You can only follow Joe's logic with him so far. You're happily going along with him for so much, and then he'll do something that is very clearly it's not morally grey, like it's there in the black. Well, I was going to say in the black or the white, but it's always in the black, dude. It's always some not good shit. Another thing that I found really cute about Joe in the first book was his relationship with Mr. Mooney, the guy from the bookshop who essentially raised him. Even though the relationship was really toxic and Mr. Mooney was like abusive to him in many ways, this was his father figure, right? And he's now an old man. And Joe kind of, it feels like he feels this responsibility to look after him in this old age, and they have this weird awkward relationship because the pair of them just feel like these two socially awkward men. And then in the second book, Joe packs up and leaves and just never visits Mr. Mooney again. We never hear from him again. It's really sad. Another flaw of Joe's that I really appreciate, that I think makes this series so good to read, is that he's genuinely scary. His emotions, I've mentioned before, totally hinge on what's going on with him in his life and with his love interest. And so when things are bad between them, the rest of the world better watch out. He treats random strangers horribly, and he like hit taxis that get in his way and stuff like that. Just treat the people around him with little to no respect. He does crazy like SH stuff, like burning his hand on the cooker. He seems to just, when things are bad, enter this in-between state where he's not with it at all. It's really effective because I think it really makes you worry for the girl that he's involved with, because you know how quickly his emotions can change on a dime. And it makes for a really intense read also. It's suspenseful because you never know what's going to set Joe off. This idea kind of comes to a head for me mostly in Beck's death scene at the end of the first book. Joe actually thinks he's killed her, and he has this intense wave of regret, and he wants her to wake up. And it turns out that she actually is awake and she was playing dead, and she tries to escape again. And even though this is what Joe wanted 5 seconds ago, now he's angry again that Beck tried to trick him, and so he ends up actually killing her this time. And then he experiences this big wave of regret again. It's crazy. He's like a fairy from the original Peter Pan who can only feel one emotion at a time. There's something I really enjoy about the series more than Joe the character really, is the way that Joe receives karma throughout. I kind of already mentioned it earlier. Even though we know what's to come and we know that it's bad for the girl involved, it is kind of nice to see Joe go pathetic over these girls in the early stages and to completely lose his sense of self over a woman. To know that all his worth comes from women is this almost like a small victory in the face of his massive misogyny and his hate crimes against women, right? There's this scene in the second one where that girl Delilah, who he has no respect for, he breaks up with Love and they end up having kind of a tryst. Okay. And when they're lying together in bed, Joe kind of makes up this scenario in his head where he fits into Delilah's life, and he has this little life with Delilah, who's this girl who he sees himself as better than, so he's never going to have to perform for her in the way that he felt like he had to perform for Love and for Beck. I think that it's a really telling moment, because even though Joe has never showed any interest in this girl in the way that he has for other women, in the obsessive way that he has, in this moment of weakness, he makes this plan to be with her because he honestly does just want to fit into anyone's life. That's what we see with all of his love interests. Joe molds himself to become their perfect man because, like, one, obviously he doesn't know who he is, and two, he thinks that's what he has to do. And this is the sadness of Joe, right? Okay, this is another one of those moments where we can feel a little bit sorry for him, because he thinks that if he doesn't perform and he's not perfect, then he's going to get abandoned by these women, obviously. It's him going too far in the performance that is the problem. Makes their entire lives a performance, and it's solely based on him and his representation of them instead of who they are as a person, because I guess Joe maybe thinks that everybody else is performing also, because that's the way he operates in the world. Maybe I'm deep in this. Maybe I went too far with this. Obviously, Joe faces no real justice so far in the book series, but we do get moments where he gets actual like comeuppance in a way. Like when he fires Curtis from the shop, Curtis and his friends come and beat Joe up and rob him, which I think is fair enough. When he breaks up with Karen Minty to go and get back with Beck, Karen Minty's brother, who's a cop, comes and beats him up and threatens him. And then there's also a time where he's trying to find this girl who stole a book from him. Not the one I mentioned earlier, this is a different girl, which is very unfortunate that Joe has to repeat his childhood trauma in this way, but I digress. He goes trying to find this girl, and it turns out that he's got the wrong address, and he ends up getting tied up with exercise bands by this girl who's like really into BDSM and knows how to tie a good knot. He's obviously in this situation where he's got to talk himself out, and she's going to call the police, and he thinks he's going to get caught. And I love seeing Joe in these situations where he feels fear and he feels panic, because this is what he's made these women feel, okay? This feels like justice to me. Weird little thing that I also like in this vein is that obviously Joe is always trying to buy drugs to incapacitate people before he kills them or whatever, or make it look like an overdose. And so a lot of his acquaintances in his life just think he's a druggie and are constantly trying to get him help. And Joe's very annoyed by this because he sees himself as an upstanding individual who's like too good for drugs. And I don't think he likes the fact that he gives off this impression to other people. So that feels like a justice in this way because it's a little hit on Joe's ego. There's also an escalation of consequences as the series goes on, which I really appreciate because obviously if Joe went through the whole series without facing any consequences, that would be boring. And these little moments are fun, but I feel like they would become too little over time. What I mean when I say escalation is Joe really doesn't kind of face any real consequences in the first book, but the parameters keep shrinking as the series goes on. So book 2 deals with some of the repercussions from the first book and Joe having to move away and start a new life after having killed Beck. Then in book 3, Love's family actually has him followed by this guy called Oliver, and so Joe really has to keep himself under wraps in order to not have himself reported back on. Then in book 4, I feel like Carolyn Kepnes really ramps up the irony a little bit, and Joe starts facing consequences before he's actually really done anything. Like, he kills off this guy, Bobby, because he thinks that he's competition for the girl that he's getting into, but then it turns out that Bobby's actually gay, and the girl was the only one who knew, so that's why the two of them were so close. And so Joe has already gone and killed this guy and made it look like an accident. He has to call an ambulance and give them this anonymous tip that he's just seen this guy at the bottom of the stairs through a window or something in order to try and save this girl's best friend who he's just accidentally killed for no reason. Also in the 4th book, Joe makes a decision to kill off his mentor in order to give his girlfriend a better chance in the workshop because his mentor really doesn't like her. And in doing so, he kills the only person who really believed in his book. So after this, Joe is the person who has no chance to move forward in the workshop, and his girlfriend actually gets a lot of the attention after this, which is what causes friction between them. There's also this amazing character called Sarah Beth Swallows in the last book, who's a fellow writer. She writes crime books that are sometimes based on true stories. She's onto Joe like a shithawk, my guy. She's the one who eventually kidnaps him in what she calls her dead shed, which is just her cute little writing room. And she gets Joe to confess and she has it all on tape. And the only thing she wants to do with it is write a good book. And she torments him throughout the last book because she obviously has these tapes and he thinks she's gonna expose him with them, right? Or tell his girlfriend at the very least. And she just never does. She just has it over him. And she's just so funny. She's just such a great character. She just really kind of torments him by not being remotely bothered that he's a serial killer. My last point about why I love Joe so much is that he's relatable. And I feel like people give me the side eye when I say that I find Joe Goldberg relatable, but let me explain. Apart from the fact that he's a serial killer and a stalker and whatever, Joe's kind of just a regular guy and he has his quirks just like all of us. They're just ramped up to a higher level than most of us, okay? Things that I find personally relatable about Joe is that he's a bit of a book snob. He goes on for chapters and chapters about how people are sheep, essentially, for buying the newest Stephen King novel. And I love Stephen King, so I can't relate to that personally, but I can definitely relate to the feeling, you know? Joe really does believe that he's a hopeless romantic, and I think that we all have that little hopeless romantic inside of us telling us to do these big grand gestures. Joe does things like worry about the fact that people are going to tell his love interest that they saw him with cat hair all over his track pants. Or when Beck turns up to his flat, he's worried that it's a fucking mess. Not just because all of her stolen shit is in there, but just because Joe's a slob in general, it seems. I didn't know where else to put this bit, so I put it here, but there's a bit where he gets fentanyl to drug somebody. I think it's MK's husband in the 3rd book. And he's so afraid of this drug and he doesn't know much about it, so he's scared that if he inhales it or gets it on his hands, he's gonna pass out or die. And it's just such a really humanizing moment for Joe, for me, because he's deathly afraid of this drug that he's going to use to kill someone, and he's handling it with such care, and he's putting a mask on and putting gloves and stuff. I think that Joe believes he's human. So in a lot of instances and throughout a lot of the books, you can believe that he's human too. And that's what makes it so interesting. That's what makes him so interesting as a character, right? Because he is essentially human, but something somewhere has pushed him to this point where he is monstrous, he's othered, right? I just love a character like that. I just love to dig into that and talk about why. But let's get back into that inner romantic statement from earlier, because this is where I'm going to get a little bit philosophical. Guys, I want you to follow along, okay? The next section I will call We Are All Joe Goldberg, and this is my attempt, I think, to make myself sound a little more normal when I compare myself to the serial stalker killer guy. So let's talk about our inner romantic hero. I think that maybe not everybody, but a lot of us can relate to a lot of the things that Joe does. Like, Joe will have a random interaction with a girl at his bookshop or in a supermarket or a library, and then he will fixate on this woman and he will create a whole character and a whole romance for them when he has had maybe one conversation or even just eye contact with her, right? And I think that we've all done this a little bit, right? We've all seen an attractive stranger on the bus or whatever and had a little fantasy about what it would be like to go up and talk to them and they'd like me too, and then we'd have a perfect little family together and whatever. None of us, well, I say none of us, maybe some of us act on it, but none of us act on it in the way that Joe acts on it. None of us take it to the extreme that Joe takes it, but the beginning seed of what Joe is doing is there. And we see this in a lot of Joe's actions. When we first meet someone, we choose to ignore a lot of their red flags or we just straight up miss them because of the rose-colored glasses, in the same way that Joe might gloss over the fact that Joe's a bit of a freaky deaky girl instead of the nice girl that he thinks she is. I don't mean to say that freaky girls aren't nice, that's not what I mean. You know what I'm saying. The nice girl, the archetype that Joe has pushed her into. I'm sure, especially when you were a teenager, you have orchestrated a meeting with your crush at some point. You found out where they worked, not through stalking them on the internet, but just like through friends or whatever, and you've turned up there to go and order a burger, maybe get the chance to talk to them outside of school or outside of work or whatever. Maybe you found out where they and their friends chill and you decide to go with your friends and just walk by one day and see if they shout you over. Joe orchestrates meeting after meeting after meeting and makes it seem like random chance. Yeah, but we've all been there. We've all wanted to be the person who makes the move, to be the romantic guy and to make this romance happen, right? And it is romantic. There's the romantic seed is there, but Joe just takes it too far every time. It's like Joe Goldberg is always rigged up to 11. And there's also a lot of the worst things that Joe does that we can find relatability in. We go through a breakup, we kind of all, I think, rewrite the narrative a little bit to make us look like a better guy than we were. Even if we can admit that we were the bad guy and we were at fault, maybe we'll leave out little details or we'll, skim over some things in order to not make us look so terrible to our friends and family who we have to live with after the end of this breakup. In the same way that Joe convinces himself that he had to stop Beck after she's dead because he says she had borderline personality disorder and she was a danger to herself, and so he was protecting her, right? Maybe we don't fantasize so much as Joe in these situations, but there's definitely a little bit of narcissism inside us, right? That makes us want to believe that we were somehow in the right in that situation. We weren't as bad. We weren't the villain in the way that the other person wants to paint us out. In the second book, Joe has an obsession with this mug of pee that he left in Beck's friend Peach's beach house that's going to link him somehow to all these murders back there. He's so obsessed with getting this mug of urine that it gets in the way of his current relationship with Love, and it's only when he's honest with her that they're able to have what seems like a good relationship. So stupid that a mug of piss is a metaphor for having baggage from previous relationships in your current relationship, but that's what it is. At least that's how I was reading it. We've all got a mug of piss. Joe says this. He says we've all got a mug of piss, but we can't let that mug of piss get in the way of us living our lives. And I think that it has to be said, okay, we've all watched Midsummer. There's a catharsis in characters killing their ex, in the fantasy of killing your ex, so that they don't have to be out there without you, ignoring you, right? That did make me sound like a little bit of a weirdo, but you know what I'm talking about. This is something we've discussed before. This is why we burn our ex's stuff. This is why we block them on all social media, because we don't want them to exist anymore without the context of our relationship. We don't want to know what they're doing. We don't want to know who they're seeing now. Fuck off. I do think I'm onto something here. I think that reading these books is such a personal experience, because when I watch other people review these books, it is wild how different their opinions are, not just to mine, but to everybody else's also. It's very rare that I see somebody get the same interpretation of a situation or a character. And I feel like that's because the characters and events are so filtered through Joe's point of view and Joe's perspective. Everything's just so coloured by his opinion of it that in order to get an accurate picture of what the world is like, the reader has to do a little bit of projecting themselves and maybe put in characters that they know from their real life who remind them of these characters that Joe is describing. Joe definitely seduces you in one way or another. He is getting you on side, whether you like it or not, even just by making you do the things that he does like this. I remember in my first video about Joe, I remember I called Love boring, and she literally turns up at the end of the third book with a fucking gun and she pulls a gun on Joe, and she is like a little bit crazy. I can see why they made her into a psychopath in the TV show. I can see where they got the interpretation of the character, and I remember not liking 40 in the book because Joe didn't like him and Joe described him so disparagingly, and I just took that at face value. And reading back after having watched the TV series, I was, surprised at how they portrayed 40 in that. But reading back through the book again, I obviously have a lot more sympathy for 40 as a person who's clearly got a drug habit and, is suffering for it. I can definitely see where they got this more fun loving, characteristic, and quirky guy from this character, but it's just not the way I pictured him at all. In fact, I pictured him as a complete sleazeball the first time I was reading it. So it's definitely interesting to read back over these books and see what Joe hid from you, essentially, and how differently you interpret things with a little bit of a different perspective. Ultimately, I think now from a female perspective, and for me personally, okay, there's a power in reading these books, in being, I guess, both Joe and Beck. We are inside the mind of the man who we fear is always watching. It's Joe is the male gaze personified, okay? We are behind enemy lines, okay? But being inside his head, we see that Joe seemingly loves Beck, okay? Despite knowing her most intimate flaws, knowing literally everything about her, even the things that she wants to hide from him, even the things that aren't good, okay? There's this sense of control for Beck almost because Joe, in his own twisted way, is doing everything for her, right? But Beck admits, I think, when she's in the cage, that she knew that Joe had followed her from a bar to the train station on the first night they officially met, and she also recognized him from the bookstore. So she knew that Joe followed her, and yet she still kind of pursued this relationship with him. She still let him be in her life. That's because Beck is us. Beck's the reader. Beck is literally every woman, okay? Beck, we the reader, was seduced by Joe. Okay, we all know how it ends because of the way it begins, and yet we're all gunning for the finish line anyway. Beck's inner romantic that we all have, that little bit of us that is Joe Goldberg, that inner romantic made her ignore Joe's red flags, and this is where we ended up. Take from that what you will. I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm just here to tell you where to start. I think that that's kind of it. I did have a little brief tangent, if you will, about men in books in general, because I remember, okay, I used to have a real bee in my bonnet about how perfect men in books were. And I think that's because obviously books are escapism and they're meant to be a fantasy. And so we can think about the perfect man, right? But I think that after reading so many books about the perfect man, that's kind of really boring. And we do want men that are more realistic because, the more realistically they're written, the easier it is to slip into the fantasy, okay? And I think that we've kind of gone into overcorrection mode in that way because there's a lot of dark romance and dark fantasy romance going on right now that is just really toxic and not where it's at. The message that it sends is not good, okay? I feel like there's a happy medium where we can just write normal boys, okay? I think that's something that I really appreciate about You, the series, about the Joe Goldberg series, and about Joe Goldberg himself, is that Carolyn Kepnes is not afraid to show us that he is the villain. For me, Joe isn't a villain dressed up as a romantic interest, okay? He's honest about the monster that he is, and that means that I can engage with him without feeling guilty about it, right? That's it.